of your lecture notes. And I'm using the PowerPoint slides that are on DTOL because for some reason when I opened up my PowerPoint through the PowerPoint file, they're corrupted and the images don't show. So I just checked and they're online. I drew them on the board this morning, so we'll do both. So we talked about the 5 different types of neurons, 3 different sensory and 2 different motor ones. So today we're going to look at the pathways and how some of those neurons make their way up to the brain for processing. And we've talked about 98% of this already, okay? So it shouldn't be more than maybe no new concepts, a reminder of some concepts, maybe a couple of new words, but it should be an opportunity where we start pulling together the structures that we've been talking about in the brain stem and in parts of the brain. So we're looking at afferent pathways today, 3 different afferent pathways. And afferent means going towards, all right? So these peripheral nerves in the spinal nerve or in the cranial neurons are going towards the central nervous system. So if it's a spinal nerve, it's going towards the spinal cord. If it's a cranial nerve, it's going towards the brainstem, carrying information about your environment towards the spinal cord for reflexes or the brain for processing, okay? So these are the 3 types of sensory neurons that use these pathways, or some of these pathways. So general somatic afferent, if you recall, is our typical pain, touch, temperature, fine touch, up here, which is discrimination, all right, as being able to tell whether you're holding a piece of cotton or whether you're holding a rock or whether, whatever, being able to discriminate the fine touch, pressure. Coming from skeletal, body wall, so the skin and joints. All right? And then also up here, there have been a lot of people today, not just you guys, that weren't familiar with the word proprioception. And so I'm going to write that one down. I've used it in conjunction with its meaning, which is joint sense. So proprioception is knowing what position your joints are in. Okay? So that's general somatic afferent, coming from the skin or from muscle joints. General visceral afferent, as you recall, is typically pain and pressure, coming from organs. So ulcer pain, chest pain, feeling a bloating sense. So pain or pressure from organs. And then our special visceral afferent are our special senses. All right. So the reason I have olfactory here is this is an exception. It doesn't use the same pathway. It doesn't go to the thalamus. All right. So its neurons are slightly different. But the other ones for vision and hearing and balance and taste will follow the typical rules of what we've been talking about. Now examples I'm going to draw on the board for sensory are following the pain, touch, and temperature of general somatic afferent. But we've already done this pathway for vision. We talked about first order, second order, third order neurons for vision. Remember, the first order was a bipolar neuron in the retina, and the second order formed the optic nerve and optic tract, going to the thalamus, and the third order neurons were the cell bodies in the thalamus, going back to the occipital lobe. Okay, so they're going to follow the same general rules, and so those rules are, and these are on page 109. First order neurons. And you can abbreviate this with that symbol. Okay. first order neurons are the neurons found in our, they form the spinal neurons, or the spinal nerves and cranial nerves. Provided the cranial nerve contains sensory information. And even a purely motor nerve, like the ocular motor nerve, is going to contain some sensory information. And what is that sensory information going to be? So what's the sensory information of the ocular motor nerve? Well, let's say the abducens. Abducens diverges to the eye, so it turns the eye that way. All right. What is that telling you? The hypoglossal nerve innervates muscles of the tongue. What sensory component? Remember I said this? Is even though we say it's only motor, it always contains this one sensory information. And it's not carried by the motor neuron. It's going to be carried by sensory neurons as part of that motor nerve. Exactly. Proprioception. So when your tongue is sticking out, I know whether it's to the left or to the right, even if it's not touching my mouth. All right? So even the motor neuron is going to carry first order neurons for the nerve that's motor. It's going to carry first order neurons for proprioception. Okay? So under the lecture notes from yesterday, under ocular motor, it's going to say general somatic efferent, in parentheses, voluntary motor plus proprioception. Okay, so it always has that sensory component. So, cell bodies of the first order neurons are found outside the central nervous system. And they form sensory ganglia. What do we call that sensory ganglia of spinal nerves? Exactly, dorsal root ganglion. We're on page 109, for those of you that are trying to figure out where we are. All right? And then the cranial nerves form specific sensory ganglia. So, for example, the trigeminal nerve is going to be the semilunar ganglion. But it's the equivalent of a dorsal root ganglion. It's formed of the cell bodies of the sensory neurons of the trigeminal nerve outside the brainstem. Okay? The geniculate ganglion is the sensory neurons for the special sense of taste from the facial nerve. Those are the two examples we looked at yesterday. And vagus has sensory ganglia as well. Okay. So those are the first order neurons. There are three. If you haven't figured that out, I mean, we've alluded to this, I've talked about it, and I've said today we're going to go through those. All right? So this green line right here is showing the first order neuron with its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. In fact, to be more correct, it's not that the cell body is in the sensory root ganglion. The cell bodies form the sensory root ganglion. It's not like we have a box and we stick all the cell bodies in there. Okay? The cell bodies are there, and that congregation of them is the dorsal root ganglion. All right, so let's look at second order neurons. Did I erase this? No. Okay. Nobody screamed when I picked up the eraser, but I thought I would check. How are we doing? Not quite yet. Okay. Then it makes sense. The second neuron in the pathway is called the second order neuron. And its cell bodies are always in the central nervous system. So cell bodies located within the central nervous system. Now, we can either call it an exception, or we can say that the optic nerve is the central nervous system. Because remember the cell bodies, when we talked about the retina, we had the first order neuron of the retina was bipolar, and that was in the retina, all right? And then we had the ganglion cell, which left the retina and formed the optic nerve. This would be the second order neuron, okay? And so I said the optic nerve is really, in reality, really part of the spinal cord or brainstem. And infections of the meninges around the spinal cord would extend out to the optic nerve. All right, so just explaining what I meant by that. The other rule is the second order neurons cross almost always. Obviously, they're in the central nervous system, so second order neurons cross almost always. And here's one of those exceptions. Because I remember I said that if this is the optic nerve, the more lateral fibers from the side of the eyeball here would cross, but these neurons, these don't cross, and these neurons do. So we had our optic pathway that looked like this, okay? And so that would be one of the exceptions. Not all of the optic nerves will cross, and then I'll show you one of our sensory pathways where they're uncrossed. But second order neurons cross in the central nervous system, usually. That was the medial part crosses. The medial part crosses. All right, so where do second order neurons end? They're going to synapse with third order neurons, okay? So the third order neurons are found in the thalamus, so second order neurons are going to terminate, that's a fancier word than, more scientific word than end. Terminate in the thalamus. And here's where we have the exception with the olfactory neuron, because we don't have the three orders. Okay, olfactory doesn't go to thalamus, so that's why I drew a line through it. All right, are we ready for third order? Okay, so third order neurons, their cell bodies form the nuclei of the thalamus. So the third order neurons of our optic pathway form the lateral geniculate nucleus. All right, third order neurons of our sensory pathways for pain, touch, and temperature form the other nuclei that I said you weren't responsible for, like the ventral medial and ventral lateral. Okay, Where do these third order neurons end? In the cortex. So they're going to end by forming synapses with neuronal cell bodies in the primary sensory cortexes, depending on what sensation they're carrying. So primary auditory cortex if it's coming from the ear, primary visual cortex if it's going to the eye, primary sympathetic cortex, the precentral gyrus, if it's just pain, touch, and temperature. The primary sensory cortices in the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, or the occipital lobe. Right? So what I've drawn up here is the postcentral gyrus. So these are going to be processing pain, touch, temperature, and proprioception. Right? So as we go through these pathways, my PowerPoint slides weren't working, so these are the same slides that are up on D2L. So I'm using the D2L site instead. But these are the diagrams that you have in your lecture notes for each of these pathways to trace along with me. And then on page, I believe, 127, there is a blank one that you can use for photocopying your, just print directly off of D2L for practice. Okay? This will be your extra credit activity on the lecture exam on Thursday. So I'll have this diagram, and I'll say, diagram the neurons of, and I'll name a motor or sensory pathway. And then you will draw in the 3 sensory neurons or the 2 motor neurons, name them, first order, second order, third order, identify any structures that they're passing through, like dorsal root ganglion or medullary pyramid or cerebral peduncle, along that line. Okay? In addition, I told the morning section that I am